in prison. And again, Kelly, being very impetuous and adventurous, tried to escape. He fell. His rope wasn't long enough. He had a rope to come down the side of the castle, and it ended about 20 feet above the ground, so Kelly jumped, and he shattered his right leg, and they had to cut it off. And so the emperor forgave Kelly and put him back to work and said, okay, now we've had this misunderstanding, but you're going to continue making gold for me, right? And Kelly said, okay, that's good. That's wonderful. And a couple of years went by, and then Rudolph started in on, are you going to tell me the secret? And Kelly said, no way. So Rudolph put him in prison again. And again, Kelly was having none of it. So on his one leg, he was hobbling through the castle toilet to escape out the poop chute and slipped on the excrement and broke his other leg, which was also cut off. So Kelly was in pretty bad shape, and he still wouldn't give Rudolph the secret. So Rudolph locked him up in the equivalent of a maximum security prison, the prison in a little town called Most, which is the Czech word for bridge. And while he was in prison, he sent to his family for some medicine, for the tincture, etc., that would cure his infirmities. And his family, because the emperor had been leaning on them very heavily, instead of sending him the tincture, sent him poison. And as Kelly lay dying, he cursed the city of Most and said that it would be completely wiped off the face of the earth. In the early 19th century, Most, which was a coal mining town, had a coal slag avalanche, and the entire town of Most is now under about 20 feet of coal slag. It no longer exists. So the moral to that story is don't piss off Eddie Kelly. The gist of it is that Kelly never revealed to the emperor the secret. Being in the English-speaking world, we all focus on D, because we know about D and his connection to Queen Elizabeth, and even in the last few years there's been more evidence of his connection with the theaters, designing the sacred geometry of the theater and then the globe. So we're much more familiar with D, but on the continent, among continental alchemists, Kelly's the hero. And Kelly's works were the basis of what would become the Rosicrucian idea of alchemy, and right on through Fulcanelli, a famous French alchemist, it's Kelly's ideas that everybody goes, oh, that's wonderful. Okay? So in the English-speaking world, Kelly is this crazy guy who had his ears cut off and may or may not have been a con man. And in the rest of Europe, he's the one true alchemical genius of the Renaissance. Interesting how that happens, isn't it? But he didn't tell Rudolph II the secret. He told a few other people the secret, Oswald Kroll, Michael Meyer, Michael Sendigovius, and they were able, from Kelly's work, to continue doing documented transmutations. So what was the secret? What was the secret that Fast Eddie Kelly was willing to die for? Well, I'm going to tell you. Most of the meteorites that hit Earth, 90%, are iron-nickel based. But there's about 10% of these meteorites that are silica-based. In other words, they're glass. And the silica-based meteorites have inclusions of heavier metal, so that the heat and pressure of entering the atmosphere infuse the silica with fused or fusion-based heavy metals, iridium, rhodium, platinum, palladium, the PMG group of metals. Now, the more platinum and palladium and iridium you have in a meteorite, the more the color of the glass becomes dark red-purple. So, starting all the way back at Egypt, if we just simply look for meteoric glass, then suddenly the whole secret of alchemy becomes very clear. We find in the Old Kingdom, the original early dynasties of Egypt, that there was an enormous amount of gold that seems to have no source. Unless you want to speculate that the Egyptians were sailing to North America and far distant places for sources of gold, then we have to say they made it, because there is no rich gold ores immediately in the Nile Valley. And there's no way to account for the amount of gold that the Old Kingdom used and had unless you want to speculate they got it from the Americas or that they made it. Now, one of the interesting things is that up until the 19th century, every apothecary shop in Europe had mummy dust. And mummy dust was sort of part of the universal panacea. You would eat mummy dust, drink mummy dust, and it would have a salutary effect on your immune system. It was a cure for lots of things. Now, in that mummy dust was gold dust, and a very strange form of gold, a monatomic gold that had sort of popped like a popcorn kernel. Now, no one really understood why that was or where it came from until you start looking for the origins of mummification. And the Old Kingdom started using a certain type of natron or salt that could only be found in one place in the western desert. And guess what? That's one spot where they found all the salt for mummification in the early dynasties was also the location of a yellow silica meteorite. In fact, some of the Egyptian glass, some of the Egyptian faience was actually made using this yellow meteoric glass. But as part of that meteor, there were other trace minerals. And at the center of the huge expanse where the yellow glass meteorite landed are the natron beds. So using the natron, the salt from this meteoric glass, to mummify, and then over time, the very subtle energies coming from the priests who were doing the rituals and coming from the energy of the bodies that were being mummified, it transmuted the heavier elements in the mummy, in the body, into monatomic gold, mummy dust. Now, very early on in the Old Kingdom, the sacred scientists of Egypt discovered the basic principle of how to use this meteoric glass to transform other metals into gold. Now, this idea remained, but the secret slowly over time was lost until you get to the founding of alchemy in the 1st century AD in Alexandria. They still had the principles, but they had forgotten what the prima materia was. In other words, the idea that this was connected to heavy metal infused meteoric glass had completely disappeared. So other than a few transmutation that we find in the 1st and 2nd century, there's a gap in which we don't find any documented, any really hard evidence for transmutation for roughly 800 or 900 years. Then something very curious happened. If you remember your Bible, when Abram switched from being Abram, worshiping the God Most High, which was Draco, to worshiping Yahweh and becoming Abraham, an event happened. Abraham sacrificed unto Yahweh, and through the middle of his sacrifices passed a flaming torch. And the tradition is that flaming torch is the meteoritic stone that's encapsulated in the Kaaba in Mecca. Now, in the early 10th century, a group of followers of the family of the prophet called the Fatimids, after Muhammad's daughter Fatima, came to power all across North Africa and in Egypt. And the Fatimids had a little splinter group called the Ismailis. They're still around. And they were pretty radical folks. So in the early 10th century, the Ismailis destroyed the current version of the Kaaba and removed the stone. And they gave part of that stone to the Fatimid Caliph in Cairo.